It was going to happen eventually. In this video, we're going to take a look at what consoles are best for anime games. If you've watched the Japanese and anime games on Xbox video, I think it's safe to say that Xboxes are probably not the way to go, except if you want some really specific stuff. So that leaves basically everything else. The thing is, there really isn't a way to come to a conclusion on which console really is the best for people who want to play anime games. First of all, the term anime game itself is really vague, since it spans so many genres and also includes very mainstream games. Other people may have something else in mind when they hear the words anime game. In my case, for example, I usually picture something a bit more obscure and occasionally low budget, which is why I often call them Japanese niche games, but not all Japanese niche games are anime games. There's also non-Japanese anime games. Do they count? I think so, but others may not. It's a really broad subject, but I think that's what makes it fun. I know I can't cover every scenario or preference that people may have, but I did my best to make sure to bring up various noteworthy points. And you can always comment as well if there's something you want to add. Alright, let's start with the consoles. I'm going to include PC as well, so perhaps saying systems would be a bit more accurate. Also, I'm going to keep things vaguely within the last 20 years, aka the 6th generation consoles and up, though sometimes we'll talk about things that are earlier than that. I don't know that much about anime games in the 90s. I'd rather make my ignorance of the era clear to everyone rather than pretending to know what I'm talking about. So what systems does that leave us with? There's 3 ways to branch out. First, the Sony route with the PS2, 3, and 4, PSP, and Vita. Or yeah, I guess the PS1 can be in there too. The second branch is Nintendo consoles, which is the GameCube, Wii, Wii U, Switch, GBA, DS, and 3DS. The last branch is the PC. They all have their own advantages, depending on what sort of thing you like. Within the last 20 years, usually PlayStations were the way to go when it comes to Japanese games. There's plenty of variety in terms of genres, and many of the biggest series are present. You also get the choice between several handheld and home consoles too. Recently, they've started censoring games. Sometimes it's trivial things, and sometimes they even manage to make things more suggestive by censoring, which is pretty funny. Game modes and functions that are fan-servicey are often removed too. Sony's meddling is causing problems for small developers, and most of us anime fans don't like creative freedom being taken away from the developers. Strange localization alterations often leave us disappointed, so seeing Sony pick on stuff that organizations like the ESRB and PEGI are fine with isn't exactly great to see. Nintendo certainly has got the hardware covered like Sony. In fact, there's even a greater variety of input methods and form factors, which may or may not be to your liking. One could argue that there aren't as many anime games on Nintendo consoles, though it seems to be changing with the latest console, the Switch. Nintendo also has well-loved franchises that never leave Nintendo's shores. The PC is an interesting one as well. In terms of hardware, it could be potentially much more expensive, depending on what you buy or put together. But at the same time, there are many ports that are very affordable during Steam or GOG sales. Plus, many games don't require that much firepower either, so you can often get by with an older computer. Often they look and perform better too, except when they don't. Sometimes the ports can be a bit crappy, which, yeah, that happens. Another thing that PCs are good for are the amount of visual novels. It's interesting that something that requires so little processing power often ends up there. Perhaps the reason for that is because some of those are or have adult-only versions, which obviously will never end up on consoles. Speaking of adult games, mods are a thing too. Let's start with Sony first. For most people wanting to get into playing anime-style games, PlayStations are usually the way to go. The variety is pretty big. We've got several series that span multiple consoles and form factors. There's a few well-known series that had been on Nintendo consoles in the past and made the switch to Sony, starting with the PlayStation. Final Fantasy, the Megami Tensei games, which eventually spawned the Persona series, the Tales series, and many more. A lot of that had to do with Nintendo not using optical media and sticking to cartridges with the N64, as well as Sony recruiting several third-party developers to make games for the original PlayStation. You'll still see a lot of Nintendo consoles get those games or spin-offs of them though. Many franchises also started on the PlayStation, as you might imagine. Xenogears on the PS2 started out as a proposal for Final Fantasy VII, but later became its own thing. That led to the Xenosaga series on the PS2 after the creator and several other people who worked on Xenogears started a new company called Monolith Soft. There was a Nintendo DS release as well, which kind of foreshadowed Nintendo's eventual purchase of that studio. And that's where Xenoblade Chronicles comes in, but let's talk about that in the Nintendo section of this video. The famous Kingdom Hearts series began life on the PS2, and while it still has a big presence on the console, the series sure liked to hop from console to console over the years. That plus the naming convention. How am I supposed to know the order? Microsoft is a mere amateur with their console names. The Neptunia series was like hold my semicolon and created some pretty crazy names as well, but these games are parodies. In the Kingdom Hearts series, they were totally serious with their titles. The .hack series by CyberConnect 2 is one that people in the comments like to bring up once in a while. The series was originally released on the PS2 and is one of the more well-known game-inside-a-game games. Disgaea made its debut on the PS2 and has a very large presence on PlayStations, with every mainline title being released on one. That's the first anime-style game I bought, actually. I love the strategic grid-based gameplay, and it's got really over-the-top things about it, and offbeat humor. There's just so much to mention, I can't possibly go through all of the franchises. There's Okami, the first two Vanillaware games, Grim Grimoire and Odin Sphere, and then there's all those games based on popular manga and anime, as well as several fighting games. Notice how everything we talked about was from the PS1 and PS2 era. That's because things have changed quite a bit once the PS3 came out. A lot of the franchises kept making games for it, but at the same time we saw the emergence of a new type of anime-style game. It's moe and fanservice games. Not that they didn't exist before, but the amount of Western releases for these games increased. As you can imagine, this is due to the PS3's higher graphical capabilities. Some of the franchises that existed during the PS2 era and earlier could finally showcase their art style in a more predominant way, while others purposefully made their characters cuter and or sexier. The Atelier series, I think, is a very good cute/moe example, just even the cover images. Well, maybe not the NA release of Atelier Rorona, which doesn't even have anyone on the cover. The game looked really wonky, but Totori and Meruru started getting more refined, and the cute imagery and art style somehow remained intact despite changing artists several times. You can't mention fanservice games without talking about Dead or Alive 5. DOA has been quite comfortable on the Xbox and 360 as well in the past, so it was a big deal to see it on PlayStation consoles again. Of course, the first Hyperdimension Neptunia came out on the PS3. In fact, the first three main titles are on the system. Neptunia is one of those games with moe anthropomorphism as its main theme. Anthropomorphism is applying human features to things that aren't, whether they're alive or not. And the moe part basically is all about making those things into cute girls. In this case, it's game consoles turned into girls. Anthropomorphism is a really common concept in Japan, but games based on that concept usually don't find much success, especially in the West, but that changed with the Neptunia series. My guess is that Strike Witches exposed Westerners to the concept, which made something like Neptunia a bit more easier to accept. You can even see the two peaks in popularity in Google Trends with the two Strike Witches seasons. And then the first peak with Neptunia was exactly the same month and year the first game was released in North America. So you can see kind of the popularity building in terms of having that concept be accepted by not the general public, but, among anime fans anyways. Things like Kantai Collection and now Azur Lane anyways, are quite popular now, but given the fact that it's been so many years, there sure is a lack of Western console releases. Something that isn't a browser or a mobile game. Back in 2011, I thought it was a pretty crazy idea to have girls represent consoles. But now things like ship girls are perfectly normal, so there you go. One thing I always need to do when talking about the PlayStation 3 is mention Valkyria Chronicles, the kind of turn-based but kind of real-time strategy RPG that takes place in an alternate universe World War II setting. It was an early PS3 title and never even featured trophy support, and it was never patched in either. I love that game, which is one reason I'm mentioning it now. The other reason is because it's a good way to transition into the PSP. Valkyria Chronicles flopped quite badly at the beginning, so the sequel came out only on the PSP. Approximately at the same time as the PS3, the PSP was also getting a bunch of interesting anime games. Valkyria Chronicles 2 and 3 being two of them. They're also exclusives. The system received several ports of popular PS1 RPGs, and also got several spin-offs. PS2 games sometimes made their way over as well. For example, the first two Disgaea games, which featured Edna and Axel mode respectively. Essentially, they're an extra storyline. There's almost too much to list. There's Kingdom Hearts, Persona, Chrono Trigger, Ys, Monster Hunter, Jeanne d'Arc, Rolancer, etc., etc. It's a really interesting mix of sequels, originals, enhanced ports, and spin-offs. And these days, the PSP is super easy to mod, so it's easy to just load up a PSP with all sorts of cool games to try out. It's also a good console in terms of variety of eras. There's a lot of 90s style games to play, even if they didn't come out in the 90s, but at the same time you could even play things that came out in the early 2010s. The PSP's successor, the Vita, ended up being an anime gaming machine too. The system received a bunch of PS3 remakes and ports, and like the PS3, the Vita's extra horsepower resulted in several fan service games ending up on the platform. The high concentration of anime games on the Vita is what kept the system alive in the West for years, after more mainstream developers decided not to make games for it anymore. And also Sony not giving a damn about it, I guess. What's interesting is that there's still Vita games coming out. That being said, several recent events have made the Vita a bit less attractive. As an option for anime gamers, many Vita games were ported to the PC, which are easy for even less fortunate PCs to run, and terribly cheap during Steam sales. Another reason is the Nintendo Switch. In a way, it serves as a spiritual successor to the Vita, as developers who formerly developed Vita games have made efforts to release games on the Switch. For many Vita owners, the Switch is great because not only can they still follow many of their favorite series, but also gain access to Nintendo-only franchises while still keeping things portable, to an extent anyways. I don't know, I still think a Switch is a little bit too big. Not sure if you're happy to see me or if that's just a Joy-Con. Sony's recent, very inconsistent crusade against fan service has left many fans feeling rather cold towards the company, and the same thing with developers. For example, the two newest Senran Kagura spin-offs are Switch and PC games only. Kind of fitting, since Senran Kagura started out on the 3DS. Overall, PlayStation consoles are a great place to play these sorts of games. What's especially nice is that many popular games have been remastered or remade for more modern consoles, which makes playing old favorites very accessible to people who don't have the older equipment. Well, I guess this is a good place to change topics and discuss Nintendo a little bit. Unlike Sony, who in terms of success remained relatively consistent, with only the Vita failing, Nintendo consoles have lived very different lives. Purely based on sales numbers, the N64 and GameCube didn't achieve the numbers of previous systems. The Wii, on the other hand, was a huge success. And then the Wii U was a spectacular sales failure. And now the Switch is doing great. So it's been quite the roller coaster ride. That being said, the handhelds have remained relatively popular over the years though. When it comes to sheer numbers, there are more JRPGs and anime-style games found elsewhere. But Nintendo has managed to maintain exclusive franchises over the years, meaning you'll find some unique stuff. Even though several developers prioritize Sony consoles during the PS1 era and beyond, there are still some developers that Nintendo managed to keep by either owning them or having close working relationships with them. Fire Emblem is one of the longest running ones I can think of. There's like over a dozen games released since the 90s, and the newest entry has proven very popular on the Switch. Several years ago, it was actually Fire Emblem Awakening on the 3DS that made the franchise popular again in the West. Xenoblade Chronicles is very well known, partly due to being part of the Xeno series that spans all the way back to the 90s, when it was pitched as an idea for Final Fantasy VII before becoming its own thing. So far, the series has 3 great games on 3 systems. Xenoblade Chronicles for the Wii, Xenoblade Chronicles X for the new 3DS, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2 for the Switch. Though I'd count the expansion as well, since it's a full game, so let's just say 4. Also, have you ever heard about something called Pokemon? It started out on the Game Boy. Yes, it may be obvious since it's so mainstream, but Pokemon games are JRPGs that a lot of people like, so that's something that needs to be mentioned. I do find it interesting that a lot of people who play Pokemon sometimes don't like JRPGs or anime-style games. I wonder how that happens. But then again, I was one of those people too, so I guess sometimes people don't see it as a Japanese thing, and there are people who just don't like Japanese things for some reason. Other franchises and games with a big Nintendo presence is Harvest Moon / Story of Seasons, Rune Factory, Dragon Quest, which is on Sony consoles a lot too, Radiant Historia, Megami Tensei, and Monster Hunter, just to name a few. Over the years, older games have been ported to Nintendo consoles, like Tales of the Abyss, which was originally a PS2 game that was released on the 3DS half a decade later. This applies to some Final Fantasy games too. A lot of times Nintendo lags behind with their hardware compared to Sony, so you'll see Nintendo consoles either getting spin-offs or ports of older games. But sometimes developers do make games only meant for Nintendo consoles. One of the best recent examples I can think of is Bravely Default, and its sequel, Bravely Second, for the 3DS. It was made by Silicon Studio, who also made the PlayStation 3 exclusive 3D Dot Game Heroes, which was a very well done copy/parody of the original Zelda and Link to the Past. Bravely Default is also an homage, namely to old Squaresoft JRPGs, but with a non-pixel-like look. It's a fantastic looking game, and it plays great. The 3D effect is actually amazing when you walk through the towns. I wish I could show you. Now with the Switch, things are a bit different. Like I mentioned before, Sony's censorship shenanigans and other reasons have brought many franchises back to Nintendo, or more precisely, away from Sony. Almost everything that could have likely made it onto the Vita or PS4 a few years ago seems to be made available on the Switch. Even fan service games. Moero Chronicles? No problem, just don't scratch the screen. Senran Kagura has made 2 spin-offs in a row that are only on the Switch and PC. No PlayStation availability at all. Idea Factory is also testing the waters with Super Neptunia RPG. Nipponichi released Disgaea 1, 4, and 5 on the Switch so far. The Final Fantasy X and X-2 remaster was released this year. Valkyria Chronicles 4 is here too. And there's much more coming up. Yeah, not bad at all. Even if the graphics aren't as nice and smooth as a true home console or PC. Speaking of PC, in the last 6 or so years, we've seen a real boom when it comes to anime-style games. Many franchises previously seen on Sony and Nintendo consoles can be found here on Steam, and more rarely, but preferably, GOG.com. The variety is huge, and often the PC is the best way to play in terms of graphical quality. But it's probably best to use a controller you're comfortable with, because some ports just don't take keyboard and mouse controls in consideration. And that's the biggest problem. PC optimization isn't always great. Sometimes it gets fixed with patches, other times not. Ports often don't have settings for graphics. 4K is not supported in many cases. Some games don't support higher than 30 or 60 frames per second either. Keyboard controls are often an afterthought, like I said. The PC port of Nier Automata is well known for its bad performance. The Disgaea PC had horrific issues with the game performance and visual artifacts, which thankfully did get fixed though. Okami doesn't go past 30 FPS. Mega Dimension V2 stutters and stops because it keeps loading stuff off the hard drive. It's not like every port is like this, but it's good to mention that these issues exist. One thing that the PC can boast about is the amount of visual novels. Not everyone may necessarily be into them, but there's a group of fans dedicated to the genre, of course. Visual novels often don't get localized on consoles, so the PC is usually the best place for Westerners to play them. Many of these have 18+ patches, so if you're into that, then the PC is the only option. Something that's emerged over the last few years are games that have an anime-style look but are not Japanese, like Honey Pop or all the Sakura games basically. Despite the PC and Steam being a great place for this sort of stuff, Steam does occasionally ban things for strange reasons while letting other things slide. Sometimes they change their opinion and reverse their decisions. They're very inconsistent, which is not confidence-inspiring. It feels like an impulsive organization rather than a professional operation sometimes. The last thing I want to bring up with PC gaming is that because of emulators, you can play a lot of older games without having to buy old consoles. Overall, it's a bit hard to say which consoles are best for Japanese anime-style games. It depends on what sort of things you value. For me, I'll say that generally speaking, PlayStation consoles cover the most stuff. During the 7th gen era, the PS3 was my anime gaming machine, and for that era, it'll be great. I thought the same thing would be true for the PS4, but the prevalence of PC ports made the PS4 less attractive for me over time. Same thing with the Vita, though there's still great consoles for those sort of games. It's just that I have a different preference. It's kind of funny also how Vita to PC ports are literally predictable phenomenons. Almost anyway. Now with Sony doing silly things, which they like to do every few years, I'm not really into the idea of giving them money. So like-minded individuals will probably be drawn to either the PC or Nintendo Switch, or perhaps a combo when it comes to current and future games. The best thing is to have, PS4, PC, and Switch, but not everyone wants to or has the money to get all three. that's not really a realistic situation for everyone. PS1s and 2s are relatively cheap, but some of the games can be quite expensive and hard to come by, which might not be your thing if you're not into collecting. Emulators might be a good alternative in that regard, though many of the most popular games are also available on newer platforms. If you like your handheld consoles, then just get mobile things. DSs, 3DSs, PSPs, and Vitas are relatively cheap, though stuff like Game Boys are also kind of going up in price. You can use flash cards to play old and out-of-print games on the DS, and the PSP is so easy to mod you can do something similar with it as well. Having a DS flash card and a modded PSP is also great because you can play fan translations of games that were never localized, like Valkyria Chronicles 3 for the PSP. As you can see, there's so many options that it's difficult to recommend, like specific consoles here. But the good thing is that no matter which console you prefer, own, or are stuck with, there's a lot of variety. So let me know what your system or systems of choice are when it comes to anime-style games, whether it's past or present consoles or any combination thereof. Also, if you're into 80s and 90s Japanese games, I'd like to hear from you too. I don't know much about them, so some insight would be cool. Like always, thank you to everyone who supports the channel. You can support the channel through, Patreon, of course, and also by getting merch. There's a new professional gaming journalist shirt and sticker available. You know how it is. Once you finish the tutorial, it's time to finish off that review too, right? So now you can show off your journalistic integrity to the world. Check the links in the description for that, as well as Twitter and all that sort of stuff. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.